introducing myself, my name is Anij. I currently consult on ITIL and DevOps best practices. I do assessments, identify process bottlenecks, and engage in CSI projects. I have over 2 decades of IT experience designing, coding, and supporting enterprise solutions. I've had opportunities to work for some great companies. I'm also a certified ITL expert and CSM. I've done a lot of ITL workshops and also and also a good amount of training as well. And I can see many of you on this call as well. So moving on from there, let's see what are our objectives. Okay, so DevOps is an initiative that is being widely embraced. So in the light of this fast pace of adoption in the industry, we want to know what DevOps is, and we want to know how it integrates with some of the existing best practices or frameworks that are out there. We also want to see how this is going to change the way we design and transition our services. Um, so these are the topics I'm going to cover today. We're just going to recap on what ITL is. I would not take more than 1 minute on that. And then I'm going to talk about what DevOps is, the integration of DevOps with other frameworks, and in particularly with ITIL, because that's the focus of this webinar. We are going to see the impacts of DevOps, and it's going to ensure that the ITIL disciplines are going to be strictly adhered to and followed through, and we'll talk about that. We will look into the impact of DevOps also on our phases, service design, service transition, and all those things. We will sort of limit ourselves to only design and transition because of time constraints. But however, we should know that the impact of DevOps is much beyond than mere service design and service transition. Okay, so what is ITIL? ITIL is a collection of best practices. Okay, I think you guys are still on the old previous slide, but yeah, just bear with me. Yeah. Okay, ITIL is a collection of best practices to deliver value to business in the form of IT services. It consists of 5 service lifecycle phases, as they call it: service strategy, design, transition, operations, and CSI. The ITL core books are pretty exhaustive to the level of detail that they provide. ITL is by far the most widely used framework in the industry. There are around 2.5 million certified people in the certified ITL foundation certified guys. So it sort of talks about the wide embracement that ITL is been adopted in the industry. Okay, now before we talk about what DevOps is, we want to talk about from where we have come. And so this slide talks about our past. We had business folks who were always ready to hand over new requirements to IT, and then we in the development team would design, code, build, test, and hand it over to operations, and everything worked as expected. Well, not always. In fact, in most cases, it never worked well. Whenever it worked well, it was always an exception. The norm was that the business thought that they had communicated everything, and development thought that they have designed and built it the right way. But then in operations, we realized that we built the wrong service, or we built the right service the wrong way. On investigation, we realized that we did not collaborate well, and it was because of multiple silos that we built into the system. Now, we have gone ahead, we have moved on from that past. Okay, we are now in a different place in time where we have adopted agile best practices. The business and development teams work off the same product catalog, and so at the end of every iteration, the development team would pick what is the top priority item as defined by business. So business and development are in sync, um, and so we are agile in that perspective. But operations team is still, they still need to contend with failures, misconfigurations, a lot of lead time to deploy and provision solutions. So in that sense, the ops are not as agile as we or as business would want them to be. Because when you talk about ops, they are more concerned about stability, whereas the development team is more concerned about making rapid changes, a lot of changes into the system. Now, ops have fears, have reasons for their fears, because you know 83% of all changes that we dish out result into failures. So naturally, under those circumstances, ops team have they are resistant to being very agile unless they they get a guarantee that the services that we deliver out is of high quality. Now, where would we like to be? You know, we would like dev and ops. Sorry. So if you look at the word DevOps, you know, it is the coming together of development and ops. And that is really the pursuit of DevOps. You know, ensure that you are agile, but at the same time, we are not going to destabilize the environment. So this is what is DevOps, the bringing together of two teams or multiple teams so that we ensure good quality IT services that goes out the gate, and which will always deliver value to customers. But let's see what Wikipedia would define DevOps to be in. So I want you to just read that particular slide, and then we'll just catch up on some keywords and we'll move on. Okay, so if you look at this slide, we see the word collaboration, we see the word communication, we see interdependence, we talk about integration. Now, the emphasis here is on collaboration, or shall I say smart collaboration. But there's a question that always looms over, you know, how do we need to collaborate better? Is it just merely removing the walls that have separated us? So let me just use a metaphor to explain what happens when can you really remove the walls as such and expect things to sort of fall in place. Now, the slide that you're going to see, the slide you're going to see is you have two countries separated by this particular wall in between. And even if you take a very cursory look at on your left hand side and your right hand side, it will highlight the varying and almost contrasting outlooks or perspectives between these two countries. So merely removing the wall will not really suffice. You know, there are a lot other factors that you need to consider. There should be a lot of discipline that has to be built in and control mechanisms that has to come into place if we are supposed to really make this amalgamation of these two entities a fruitful association. So now here, what are the factors we need to consider? One is we need to look into from an organizational perspective. You know, traditionally we have organized skills in functional silos. So you have a DB team, you got a network team, you got a storage team, and you got all these silos being built into organizations. But DevOps is all about bringing cross-functional people together. Now, I'm not trying to say let's just have one big team. We'll talk about that sometime later on. But we need to re-look into the way we have built these silos. Another aspect is we need to look into how do we measure success for different teams. So traditionally, Dev and Ops team have got different KPIs to evaluate themselves and to measure success. Okay, now DevOps says, we can't have multiple ways of defining what is success. We need to have one consolidated common KPIs that we need to adhere to. Another factor is processes. Now, dev team in generally uses Agile, Scrum, or Kanban, or any of those methodologies. Ops uses ITIL. Now, here in DevOps, we are saying, well, we can still use two frameworks, but we need to sort of interface them better. We need to ensure that we use the best of the two and get going. Another factor to consider is from a tool set perspective. Typically, you just look into what tools would a dev person use and compare it to what tools a system administrator would use. They are so different. But here, we're not trying to say let's all use same set of tools, but we need to interface these tools. We need to ensure that we build automation into it. We want to ensure there's an end-to-end visibility. We want to ensure that the quality is never compromised. Constant feedbacks are there in the system, and of course, some sort of a continuous integration. We'll come to those terms later on. But then we want to ensure that we are on the same page, even though we use different tools. And the last, but perhaps the most important factor is the culture. The development QA team and operations team have always worked independent of each other with very little collaboration. But here we are saying in DevOps world, we need to have a team of skilled professionals with the right attitude, with the right behavior, and with the motivation which will push them to work in a very safe environment, which refers to the fact that you can take little amount of risk. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But you think about, although we have all these factors or as hurdles that we need to jump over, but look at the DevOps success that is out there. It's all over the place. You look at Facebook, you look at Amazon, Spotify, STC. They're just few among hundreds of companies that have worked around these factors and have delivered good. Now the question is, how do they really do it? What do these high performance companies really do? And that's where they build multidisciplinary teams. And look at this definition. It's so good. It says who take end-to-end responsibility to deliver customer value early and often while continuously improving their processes. So here we are talking about the fact that you really cannot work and I take responsibility of storage, and you take of network, and you take of database. Then it all becomes, I did my job, and what about you? So here we are saying we need to have an end-to-end perspective. We need to deliver value as early as possible and as often as possible. Now, if we do this, what would be the results? And this slide talks to you about the results that we would gain if you adopt DevOps. And these are all numbers that are out there, which are proven numbers. So if you look at the top left, it says that if you adapt a DevOps way of doing things, your likelihood of making a release is 30 times more than if you do otherwise, and which gives you a competitive advantage because you are releasing at a faster pace than otherwise. If you look at the bottom right, it talks about the fact that if I talk about the deployment lead time, we are saying that if you adhere to DevOps, there's an improvement on your development lead time by 200%, or your time to recover is 168 times more than otherwise. And look at the success rate. We know the industry rates, 83% of changes fail. But here we are saying if you adopt to DevOps, your chance of your change being success is as high as 65% or 60%. Okay, so we saw what DevOps is. We saw, we want to see how it meshes, how it integrates with ITIL and Agile way of doing things. Now, if we look at this slide, I'm just going to read little of these slides. Most of you may be familiar with the Agile Manifesto. Here we say that, we have come to value certain things on the left hand side over many things on the right hand side. Now, if you look at the fourth row, or sorry, the third row, it says customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Okay, now here, um, if you look at this, they're talking about collaboration upfront. This, they're really talking the same language as DevOps is now driving it. It's very interesting. So DevOps, in a sense, is not really new. The intention to collaborate better was always there. Now I think the business is pushing it a lot more than otherwise, because business would lose out if we make once in a year release. So in that sense, there's a pressure on business. Now, apart from that, the tools have come to aid us in the sense, I would say technology, because I think virtualization has changed the game and we have to respond to those things. Now, this is how typically a Scrum team would work. You start with understanding business requirements, and then they get into a product backlog. And this backlog is managed by a product owner who really represents business. And the Scrum team would pick up the top items from this product backlog, and then they would go into these iterations. They would build, test, and have a potentially shippable software at the end of the iteration. Now, at some point, this shippable product goes out into operations. Okay, so we want to see how this fits into where does the DevOps come in? And if you look now at the slide, we see how DevOps is bringing about a collaboration. It talks about iterative development cycles. It talks about amplified feedback mechanism, which in a sense is really built into the agile way of doing things, because we got sprint review meetings, we got retrospective meetings, wherein we sort of go through all these things. Now, an interesting observation here is we see how operations gets involved upfront. If you look at the bottom, that operations row, you see NFRs, non-functional requirements. So when we talk about DevOps, we are talking about the fact that we get operations guys early involved, so that even during the envisioning stage, we consider non-functional requirements. Okay, now let's bring in ITIL and see how ITIL fits in. Okay, now here you see the integration of all these three frameworks, right? You have strategy in your envisioning part, then during your production of your service, your design, your product backlog, you got a design, then you got your iterations, which is your transition, and then of course, so in a sense, they all fit well and they come together well, they mesh well. They really do not really conflict with each other. They sort of complement each other. Okay, so now we saw what DevOps is, we saw the factors that we need to consider, we saw how these frameworks handshake with each other, and now we come to the important thing, how do these, what is the impact on us? People who practice ITSM, what is the impact on us? So I want you to read that slide. It's written by, if you buy the book DevOps Cookbook by Jim Kin, you would find it. But I want you to just read it for a minute, and then we'll talk about it. So he's a DevOps, Gene Kim is a DevOps evangelist, and he says the goal of DevOps is not just to increase the rate of change, but to successfully deploy features into production without causing chaos and disruption and disrupting other services, while quickly detecting and correcting incidents when they occur. And this brings in the ITIL discipline. Now think about the other picture of the country that you saw, the border between those two countries. Now, if you remove away the boundary, you really cannot survive in that particular environment, unless, because it says here, if you look at the statements, without causing chaos, you want to ensure that you got controls in place so that chaos doesn't happen. By you doing that, it should never disrupt other services. That means you go and fix one service, there should not be an unintended effect on other services. If you should have good monitoring in place so that you can detect as soon as something goes wrong, you're not really, it's not being reactive, it's being proactive. You want to detect it upfront. You want to detect them, and if possible even correct them. And then Jenkins says, here you bring in the disciplines that ITIL talks about. Now think about this, ITIL has got a bad press for n number of reasons. The other day I was in a training and someone told me, what happens if we adopt ITIL to the world? Will everything be okay? So I said, no, it's never going to be okay just because you adopt ITIL to the world. Ultimately, you should change, we should change the hearts of people who run these operations. It is more of a cultural or it's more of an attitude. But as long as operations team thinks that their job is to just manage it on in a live environment, and dev thinks, well, their job gets over once they push things over the wall, then we can never get this working. The bad press that ITL has got is all because of bad implementation, or they're not used it exhaustively. ITL says it's a non-prescriptive way of doing things. So you can't really push it and say just follow it as it is, because the way you do business in Credit Suisse may be different from the way you do in Danske or in ANZ Bank. So in that sense, one has to be sensitive to the usage of ITIL. Okay, now, so let's now come back to this particular slide. We are talking about ITIL disciplines. Now, Gene Kane in his book talks about the three way of doing things in DevOps. And the first thing that he touches upon is what he says system thinking. He says, business and customers should be in handshake. That means the guys who create solutions should perhaps know how things should work in operations, and there should always be an end-to-end holistic view of how you do things. It involves all your stakeholders. It includes functional requirements as well as non-functional requirements. Often they sort of get slipped under the carpet, and then we think about it too late in the game. Now, how does ITL support it? Well, ITL, on your right hand side, you have that particular picture which talks about how you have feedback mechanism. ITL was always in terms, although it might seem to be like a waterfall mechanism, but we talk about continual feedback mechanism that is built into ITL, the fabric of ITL. ITL service design books does talk about extreme programming, about agility. So in that sense, we want to ensure that we get the whole picture and we get it right. Okay. The second way that Gene defines is you want to amplify feedback loops, which means that this means a continual cycle of validating value and quality through shorter feedback loops. We want to ensure that we make things. Now, if you look at your bottom left, you have this, you could do changes, maybe 3 changes a year, but then it means that each change has maybe 200 changes inside, right? So you want to ensure that you make these multiple changes over and over again, rather than consolidating too many things into one shot. So in that sense, you sort of, the risk factor of failure or the impact of the failure is too little than putting 200 changes into one shot. And the third way is what he calls the culture of continual experimentation and learning. And this is where I talked about the cultural aspect. In a safe environment, you should be able to work and take some level of risk in collaboration with your customers. Now, this doesn't happen on day one when you handshake with the customers, but having worked with a customer for 5 years, that trust should have already been got from the customer that you can do certain changes, and you may either go wrong, which is still okay, but you can always revert back to an operational environment. So here's all about bringing those disciplines in place. We need to adapt those ITL disciplines, ensure that they get impregnated into the system. They are delivering value, good mechanisms so that you can detect changes, detect proactively, sense change in configuration, and auto default back to the right mode. Okay, now the last topic is about what is the impact on ITL phases and processes. Now I said that the impact of DevOps is not just limited to service design and service transition. It does impact the way you do strategy, the way you do operation, the way you do continuous service improvement. Okay, having said that, in this webinar we are only going to talk about design and transition, and even that not to the big extent because of time limitation. But let's just talk about the introduction of microservices in service design. Now, um, this is basically a picture of an online book retailer, and if you look at the services that he is providing, on the yellow boxes depict services where a end user who logs into a particular retail portal can add some books into some wish list. I may think about buying it or I may not. Okay, I just want to put it there. So it's a placeholder to manage wish list for all users who would come in and put their wish list. In the middle, the green boxes depict the orders. Now, maybe I put into my shopping cart and now I say, okay, I want to process it and I want the item. So then you have these orders which takes care of, it's a middleware processing services that have to be redundant to handle concurrent users. So naturally you need a big amount of them. They are important for you. Now we will also have to federate our DBs to get that extra mileage. Now if you look at the bottom, the one that is circled in green and yellow, there's a database there, which means that you don't have one big monolithic database to manage all your requests, right? Which means that we need to slice and dice our database based on the business process it is supporting. So if you want to manage a wish list, and if you were to write a service to manage wish list, then your database, you should only talk to that particular table or that particular database which manages your wish list, and not the one that manages your orders or even processes those orders. So in that sense, we are talking about re-architecting the way we persist data. Okay. Now on your right hand side, you will see the ability to quarantine bad instances. So again, I got some maybe 4 instances which will process the order. Now maybe one of them go bad for n number of reasons, or maybe one just had a memory issue or a CPU issue, or someone got hacked into it. Then we want to quarantine it, we want to move it away and not affect the other ones. At the same time, we want to think about putting deployments, hot fixes. So the whole point, so DevOps does take you to the era where you do not have downtime at all. Think about companies like Facebook. They got an update getting into the production server every day, but there's no outage at all. Or we talk about Amazon Web Services, they got 2,000 to 3,000 plus changes to the production server every day, and they do it. LinkedIn, Twitter, all of them, they do it. So we are going to the era where there's no downtime at all. That means you could have some instance coming down and some instance coming up, but the end user who is requesting for a service will be always by a load balancer of some way. He will be directed to the live instance. You could also have, you could have, let's say, the order service. You could have a new version of orders and old version of the orders existing at the same time, and you may have certain people directed towards a new service, whereas some looking into the old service. Now many times you would notice this, when you log into your bank portal, they would say, we have changed our UI, but if you want, you can still go back to your classic view, in which case you can swap to that. So this can happen not just at the UI layer, it can happen at your middleware layer, your database layer, your reporting layer, all these components. So what are we really doing here? What we are doing is that we're not talking in terms of applications. We're talking about services. A service to process an order, a service to manage a wish list, in that sense. So now we need to look into our existing architecture, and we want to ensure that we build in microservices. We are slicing and dissecting our app. So adoption to DevOps from a design perspective is a huge task, and that calls a lot of changes from our end. Okay, now we just talked about, there are many other things that we can talk about in service design, like how you deploy it, but we can do it at a later point. Now when it comes to service transition, we want to introduce disciplines such as continuous integration. Now what is continuous integration? So let me just work around with this one. If you look at the slide, you have developers on your top left who are checking in code into a version control system. Like the ones that is used widely in the world is Git, which is a distributed version control system, unlike the non-distributed centralized version control systems. But once someone checks in, automatically there is a trigger, and it triggers a continuous integration server, or a build server. Jenkins is used very widely there, and that may go and call a Maven or a Ant build script, and it will run all those test cases, and everything is good. It will create a binary file or an executable file, and it'll put into a repository, and then it lands on the right top into a staging area where someone is testing it, validating it, and if everything is good, then of course at some point in time we push it into a production server on your bottom right. So now if we had to build this whole network of notification and automation into a system, we need to do a lot of planning. So the way we make releases, the way we handshake, release, change, and deployment, and also think about the configuration that has to be managed here is humongous. So this is a huge change, but the value that brings us is that once a developer checks in the wrong code, immediately in case the test fails, we get to know about it, and he is notified about it, and he can fix it right away. Okay, now if you go to the next slide, now we are going to talk about processes. Okay, we talked about service design, we talked about service transition, the impact on them, but I want to take maybe 2-3 processes. We want to talk about, in this slide I talk about, on your bottom left I talk about change management, and on your right hand side we talk about release and deployment. Okay, so here we're going to see shorter changes, and we're going to see frequent changes, and that will enable us to fail fast and recover fast. Now with respect to release and deployment, we need to have a delivery pipeline that we built in, okay, with all the dependencies that are already built in the system, and wherein you can schedule a release based on some triggers, or it could just be time based. Maybe once in an hour I just create a new release, and if it passes through all the QA gates, it goes and sits into my repository. I take a snapshot of it, and someone is notified that we have a new release. Then of course we're not trying to say we'll automatically deploy it. That can be a manual step, or it can also be an automatic one. Now release and deployment is the most painstaking process in most organizations, because we don't do this that often. And because we don't do it that often, we do not learn from our previous mistakes, and so we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. So in DevOps world, what they advocate is that whatever process is the most painful process, we want to do it more often, because the more often you do it, it is very likely that the pain gets into someone's dashboard, and then we learn from it, and we ensure some level of predictability, and then we master that particular process. Okay, now I want to talk about changes to a process known as, in the layman's term we call it configuration management, but you could talk about, in ITIL we call it service asset and configuration management. Now here the impact to the SACM process is huge, both in terms of volume, but also because of its dynamic nature if you are in a cloud environment. So on the top left you see templates. We have templates for everything, because these templates enable us to reuse them. So we have database server templates, middleware application server templates, we got web server templates, and you could build a number of templates. And these templates are all going to be used when we go and build our system and bring up our system. If you see our bottom right, you have this the PXE server on, which is handshaking with the boot images. Now PXEs are really pre-boot execution environments. They pick up images from a repository like Nexus or something. They pick these images and they patch it on to new VMs. They deploy new VMs, and in this case they have used Puppet. You could use any of those configuration tools like Puppet or Chef or Ansible or SaltStack, but you use them and then you bring these systems. And on the right hand side, you have these intelligent platform management interfaces that underpin the lights out management technology that enables users, admins to access servers that are in a remote manner. So in a sense, if you look at this diagram, you see configuration management takes a very big hit when we adopt to DevOps if you want the value out of it, right? Especially when it is, you bring up thousands of VMs on demand, you configure them, and it's not just about configuring them, you want to control the configuration over them. The other day someone asked me, how do you explain configuration management, the use of how DevOps can help you in a non-IT environment? So what I said was, let's say I'm driving a car, okay? So maybe it's a car manufactured by, say, Maruti or whatever it is. So when a car, let's say I'm driving at a high speed, the state of the machinery should be in a particular state. That state could have been captured at the factory, and as I change my speed, those configurations can be controlled. Now, as a driver, if I am violating any of those pre-built configuration, and if it exceeds a particular threshold, then the configuration manager can say, well, he's doing the wrong thing, and you can slap or override my configuration, by which you save my life. And there was this ad a couple of years back where a Google vice president says he was driving his Mercedes Benz and he never knew that someone was in front or someone cut him in between and the vehicle stopped. So based on these configurations, you can control the working of your environment, working of your services. So that is beautiful if we use configuration management in the most appropriate manner. Okay, so I'm really done with those processes. We talked about we just recapped on what ITIL was. We talked about what DevOps is, where have we come from having adopted to agile way of doing things, what is our future, how DevOps is not a new story. ITL and agility frameworks were all sort of talking about the same thing, but it has come to it has got its spotlight today because of business crunch and also because of virtualization. And then we said, how does it impact ITSM world? We talked about enforcing good disciplines. We talked about how it impacts the way we design our solutions, the way we transition it, not just between development and QA, but also from QA to a staging area and even to a production box. And then we talked about how we briefly touched upon change management, release and deployment. We talked about the continuous integration and all those things. And then we talked about impact to service asset and configuration management, or what we call as SACM. Okay, now in summary, DevOps adoption requires reorganizing our service lifecycle. We need to build automation at all levels, and we need to continually align with an ever-changing business needs. So that's something so we don't have requirements that is going to stay put at one point and stay put forever. DevOps has come to stay. It will disrupt our established way of doing things. So one has to be prepared. It is going to think. And one thing that amazes me is the dashboards that we create. When DevOps comes in, and especially when you remove away the manual inputs or the manual way of doing things, you'll see a huge number of numbers that come and display sometimes many unpleasant things. Okay, all said and done, 70% DevOps projects fail because of ignoring the cultural aspect. Yeah, so you cannot ignore them. In ITL, we talk about the 4 P's, and we talk one of the P's people. So you can't really overrun that and still have a great DevOps team. So one has to cater. And so what I say is that you begin with that first. You educate them first. You make them aware first, and then they come as they sort of agree with you, and they stand by you, and they are going to support you in your engagements. Okay, this quote is from Daniel Ek. He is the CEO of Spotify. You can go and see about Spotify at YouTube or on Wikipedia. Okay, he says this: we aim to make mistakes faster than anyone else. Well, it looks very negative, but then his logic is, if you fail faster, then you learn faster, because you know that you make all these errors, and so you learn it fast. Now, is even before it hits the customer, you want to fail in your own environments, in your unit testing or in your integration testing. So once you have this knowledge of having learned from these failures, you can improve faster and you can deliver faster quality services to your customers. Yeah, you can read about Spotify. Some very good videos are there online. So I just wanted to stop with this particular quote. Okay, now I'm really done with my presentation. I just will talk about some, these are some links. I'm going to send you all these things. So there's some links that you can refer to. There are some books that I've listed at the bottom. If you're interested in service design, you certainly need to read the leftmost book, DevOps, Software Architect's Perspective. But anyone, I think, should read the DevOps, the practical DevOps. Okay, I do weekend trainings on DevOps. I offer two offerings. One is a manager course, another one is a practitioner course. Both of them cover DevOps fundamentals. But if you look at the manager course, apart from the fundamentals, I talk about dysfunctional science. Now, there's a good thing, many customers would say, well, I have no problems at all. There's nothing that's wrong. We are okay. SLM chart shows all green. There's no reason for us to go and adopt to a new framework. Well, there may be some dysfunctional science that is there in your environment, which you can use as an opportunity to showcase to your business and in why you need to adopt DevOps. Okay, so we'll talk about that. We also will talk about how do you assess the maturity level, and also if you're already into DevOps, what is your DevOps readiness state? Also the way you organize your DevOps team. Now, earlier we said there's a storage team, there's a network team. We're not trying to say that they all should be part of one big team, but the way we organize our teams is very important. We'll cover that when we do that particular training. And then of course there are always challenges when we adopt to anything, so we want to overcome those challenges. Now, that training is more for managers, people who have to be aware of DevOps and the challenges, because if you're not, your customers are already talking about DevOps. If you do pre-sales, all your customers are talking to you about DevOps. So it is, think about this. If you're not into DevOps today, you just see what you'll be doing 9 months from now. You will be working on DevOps, because that is the fast pace in which the industry is adopting DevOps. Okay, so by the end of 2016, you will be on a DevOps project for sure. Okay, so you need to have that sort of insight when customers talk to you about DevOps. Then the other course is basically a practitioner course. Again, I cover the DevOps fundamentals, but then I do a hands-on with certain tools like JIT, Jenkins, Maven, Vagrant, Ansible, or Chef, and then I also do on Docker. So they both are 2-day offerings. You can have both classroom as well as online, but I do it on every weekend.